an interesting figure you mentioned piqued my curiosity. It costs about 158 trillion to repair, turn around the global climate problem. That's approximately twice the global domestic product annually. But amazing, it's about 1/5 of the total derivatives in circulation around the world. And what strikes me is if we can only mobilize 20% of those derivatives that are actually financial resources simply breeding itself into repairing climate change where it's meant to go, I think it's quite a doable proposition. Just wanted to give that comment and get your feedback on that. Thank you.
I think the point that the report was trying to make is that we could actually do more now that would therefore reduce the burden in trying to deal with climate-related disasters in the future. So it's around action that we can take now. And I suppose then thinking about the ways that we can actually achieve that in practice in terms of raising that kind of financing, in terms of who should actually be funding that, I think that raises a whole set of interesting options. But the economics behind that is not my forte, so I can't directly respond to your question on that. So sorry.
It strikes me that it's a similar situation here in Australia. About 95% of all natural disaster-related expenditure is spent after the fact, and only 5% before the fact, trying to reduce the vulnerability. So while you say that yes, 20% of the derivative market could repair that future damage, asking those traders to give up 20% of their profits, I think might be challenging.
My question is for Professor Hughes. James Hansen's written a recent paper, which I haven't read because it sounds like it's far too difficult for me to read, but he predicts mega storms in the ocean, big enough to stop shipping, such a scale. And one of his books was Storms of My Grandchildren. I think he has a facility to find the dramatic image. And Sarah also talked about not frightening people, finding a positive spin to put on things, which there's a tension between those two things. But what do you think about the science messaging? Do you think we are telling the people exactly how it will be quite soon and is already? Or is it just getting diffused? I think there's some problem about that. My question for Sarah is about carbon rations. Have you any thoughts on carbon rations?
As you say, we walk a very fine line. You have to scare people enough to make them want to change, and not so much that you make them shut down. Let me give you a very recent and real example at the Climate Council. So as many of you would know, and Sarah mentioned it, we're a publicly funded organisation. We replaced the Climate Commission that was sacked by the Abbott government. We've now put out over 50 reports. Some of those reports are on impacts and risks, and some of those reports are on solutions. So we try to sort of do both sides of the fence. But we had some really interesting comments from some of our supporters just the other day. We've just a couple of weeks ago, we put out a report on the coral bleaching that I spoke about tonight. And it's depressed some of our supporters so much that they've emailed us to say they're thinking of giving up donating to us because they've simply given up, which was not quite our intention when we put out the bleaching report. But it just shows how difficult walking that line really is, because you walk the line differently with different communities. There's no one perfect message and there's no one perfect way of delivering it. So all we can keep doing, I think, is to tell the science like it is, not shy away from the facts, but also offer solutions and hope at the same time, and hope that that hits the mark. Carbon rations.
So I think one of the challenges in relation to individual action is in terms of how much of that we make that something that people are forced to do, or how much of that we make as a kind of an option. And so I think one of the challenges with carbon rationing is that, well, one of the advantages is that it forces people to fundamentally change their lifestyles. And I think at the moment what we assume is we can kind of carry on as normal, but there'll be some technological advances that might actually save us. And I think one of the advantages of carbon footprints or carbon rations is that it actually forces us to take a very a very clear look at our own behaviour and think about, well, what is it that we're actually doing? And often people are very surprised by how much of that comes from meat consumption, for example. It's often the largest proportion of people's carbon footprints. So I think there's a real balancing act here between forcing people to act in that sense in terms of rationing carbon, saying you can't fly long haul anymore, you can't fly overseas anymore, because of the real kind of cultural values associated with that. So for me personally, I have family back in the UK. It'd be very challenging for me to be told that I couldn't fly back and see them anymore. It would make a real clear impact on my lifestyle. But on the other hand, I've chosen to live in Australia. I've chosen to make that choice to live so far away from my family. So I think a lot of it comes down to individual value judgments here, and I'm not sure I've got a clear answer for you. I think it's a really difficult one.
Now with climate change, all our models up until now are essentially going to be challenged, or will actually fall apart in many ways into the future, simply because things are now moving into unprecedented events. One question is as follows. Forget about for a moment for the 99% of the population that by the top 1% of users like the plebs or the goy or whatever it may be, right? If you are the rich or the powerful, moving in from here on in, because up until now this discussion has been a 1990s sort of mindset by the elite. My question is, if you're the rich or the powerful, and all of a sudden you find that your wealth base or your power base is being reassessed and revalued in completely different ways to what you've been getting so far, from that perspective, because they're the ones that once they're challenged, they really start to take action from a different angle. My question is, how will the elite be able to handle things when they realise that it's actually affecting them just as much as everyone else?
Look, we are seeing real change in the business community, and if that's, I guess, represents a lot of the elite. One of the most exciting groups of events that was happening in Paris was run by a group of people called We Mean Business, who represented some of the largest companies in the world, IKEA, Philips, Unilever. They are really getting on board because the message has finally got through to many in the business community, so many of your elites, that climate change is a risk. It's a risk to their business, it's a risk to their asset base. And once that has been recognised, then it's treated just like any other business risk, in a sensible sort of a way. I guess the other aspect of, I think what you're getting at, well, it has relevance to what you're getting at, is that as we transition from this economy, old economy, to a new economy, whether you call that a sharing economy or a service economy or whatever, but as we stop relying on stuff we dig up out of the ground and sell to the Chinese, then all sorts of other things are happening. So climate change in some ways is a catalyst for all sorts of, not just social unrest and social stress, but also social change. So, moving ahead in the brave new world as more and more pension funds and superannuation funds start to divest from fossil fuels because it's, coal is becoming the new tobacco and the faster that happens, in my view, the better. We will see, I think, in the next couple of decades, just extraordinary transition. There'll still be elite people. They might not be the same elites as before. They might be the people that have got in early and done some really clever things with renewable energy, and good for them.
I think I would support Leslie's points there. I did some research in the UK that was looking at the role of corporate actors and their responses to climate change. And again, it was very much framed as this business risk. So how can we ensure that our company survives into the future? And climate change is seen as one of the major risks that will affect that. But there was also a very clear sense around questions of responsibility. So whether that's framed in terms of corporate social responsibility, whether it's a broader sense of actually we're a very large player, therefore we should be acting on climate change. And there was a real sense there of those two things coming together, obviously fundamentally driven by the business case. So in this case, it was an example of a UK supermarket chain, very much focusing on how they could start to calculate carbon and count carbon in their own business, and how they could have an influence over their suppliers as well. So a really large supermarket has that capacity to actually influence all of their supply chains. And so they were trying to do that in a very rational, kind of calculated sense. But there was also a clear reflection from their perspective in terms of saying, well, actually, we're a really big company. There isn't enough government action in this particular space at the moment. Perhaps we should take that initiative and we should actually be acting in that space. So it wasn't just a purely financial model. It was very much driven by ideas around ethical and corporate social responsibility as well, not just in a kind of greenwashing sense, but in a broader kind of moral and ethical sense as well, which is quite interesting, I think.
I'm just a reference to Naomi Klein, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. And she states that climate greenhouse gas emissions have risen 61% since 1990 and the rate of increase is increasing. According to Klein, the reason for this failure is that the present capitalist profit system is intrinsically incompatible with climate and environmental sustainability. And she draws upon Swedish research which establishes a direct causal link between corporations' quest for cheap, exploitable labour and rising carbon emissions. Because if you're a corporation and all you care about is cutting your production costs, it's going to be cheap, abused, outsourced labour that doesn't have the freedom to organise, and it's going to be coal, the dirtiest of all the fossil fuels. And by outsourcing their manufacturing, the rich countries are effectively exporting their emissions. And Klein argues that our only hope is the rise of mass movements with the combined goals of saving the environment and achieving social justice. Your comment, please.
I saw when Naomi Klein was here talking at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas last year, and she's an incredibly inspirational speaker. And I think the really powerful thing that came across there was that this power of collective action. So there was a question there around, well, what can we actually do in response to that? And in terms of, there is a real sense of, feeling individually empowered by that collective action. And perhaps in reflection to my response to the last question as well, I think there's a really fine line between corporations, acting in this kind of greenwashing space and actually pretending that they're doing the right thing in terms of promoting their reputation, and actually really trying to understand what it is that they're actually doing behind the scenes. And I think the more that we can hold those types of organisations accountable, so the more that we can actually ask them to publish their carbon budgets, for example, actually ask them to make those figures available, the more that we can actually start to trace those connections between what's happening in Australia, for example, and how that might be connected to other parts of the world. So I think there's a real sense that if we can push for that transparency in terms of not only financial accounting, but in terms of carbon accounting, that actually puts us on a much better track for actually perhaps producing action in the longer run. So.
With regard to my question, first of all, I want to give you some feedback with regard to politics in the pub. I thought it might have been about 5 years ago that we had a wonderful sequence on global climate change, and that was to do with avoidance. And I remember the being sort of warned, we've got to start now. I think we're underway now. But my question is that in terms of that move from the physical sciences, I'm a retired science teacher, from the physical science teachers to the geographers and the life sciences. And I originally thought of my question in terms of research and development, in terms of what research might be undertaken. But I think I'll shift you can answer it in any way you like, but I'll shift my question to what are the sorts of changes that we need to research and develop in terms of the education and its promotion in the public domain and civil society. We need a foundation for personal, you mentioned personal considerations, for social and essentially political learning that we need to go through to carry out the sort of changes that are needed in this coming phase of climate change.
As a climate counsellor and a former climate commissioner, I've spent a lot of time trying to educate the public. And I still think that's an important role that I have. But often I get accused of preaching to the converted. No doubt I'm doing that right now. When I started on the commission, I felt that we were presented with some CSIRO research, and actually the person that did that research just got made redundant. It's true. Yes. Which showed that in the Australian population, there's about a 7% of the population that would be classified as the true denialists. It's a very small little wedge. Then there's about half and half of the rest of the population, half that sort of say it's just natural variability, you know, climate's changing but it's just natural variability, and the other lot that say no, it's human activities and we need to do something about it. And the line between those two segments of the pie chart, you know, varies quite a bit. And it's now probably about 70% of the Australian public that say yes, we understand that human activities are contributing to climate change, we're concerned about it and the government should do more about it. But when I started on the Commission, I really felt that it was my role as a climate change educator to get all those people that just thought it was natural variability to shift into the other part of the pie. And after going around the country for 2.5 years, talking to groups like this and all over the place, all over Australia, I actually, and getting sort of had the comments, you're just preaching to the converted, I actually changed my mind about that. And I thought, it's actually not my role to convert. There's a lot of religious imagery in climate change, of course. It's actually my role to talk to the converted and try to motivate them to action. Because you could have 22 million people in Australia sitting around on their couch with perfect knowledge about climate science and lots of concern, and if they're just sitting on the couch, then the atmosphere doesn't change one iota. So to me, the important thing is, yes, education's still important. I'm still more than happy to talk to people about climate science. But I think the really important thing to do is to take those people that are concerned and motivate them to the next step, which is to vote, to look after their superannuation, to live their own lives as best they can in as low a carbon environment as they can, etc., and talk to their friends and try to influence people. So it's the converted that we need to keep talking to. I don't know if that answers your question, but...
It's an excellent answer.
Thank you.
Could I have a geographical...
Geographer?
So I'm not sure it's a geographical answer, but I think I would draw on Leslie's point and say there's a real need to, I think, draw climate change into our everyday lives. If we constantly position it as a kind of separate issue to what we're doing, then it becomes very difficult to deal with. And the most successful projects that I've seen are those that actually don't make climate change the absolute focus of what they're trying to do. So they make the focus on issues around energy poverty, for example, or around energy efficiency, which in the UK is very much around keeping your home warm in winter. And by doing that, essentially focusing on energy efficiency, you're providing draft insulation, for example. By default, you're therefore reducing carbon emissions. And it's at that point you can start to have a conversation with people about climate change, because people often feel it's too big an issue, they can't individually act on it. People feel that actually it's something that's out there that somebody else will be working on, for example. If you draw it into other conversations and draw it into other areas, it becomes something that's much more manageable. And another example I draw on working with the community around food growing. So there was a real passion within a particular group for growing local food. And it was as part of that, part of developing community gardens, that then enabled discussions about food miles, about locally grown food, the benefits there of the sharing economy. And as part of that, you could then draw on questions around, well, how does that relate to climate change and how might we use this as a way of acting on climate change? So you're drawing it into everyday things that people are actually already interested and engaged in, rather than trying to just say, well, let's talk about climate change, let's deal with climate change, because that can feel a bit alienating at times, I think. So that's maybe not a geographical answer, but hopefully provides some reflection.
Oh, it's a good science education.
I've got a lot of questions and nobody behind me. Firstly, just to answer a question that Kieran pointed out about cheap labour, I don't think that's going to be a problem in the future, because the way robotics are developing, they're going to take over, so we'll have another problem about mass unemployment. So I think there's going to be less of an issue than you might think here. I wanted just to put two questions to you. Firstly, in terms of something that I actually did put to some people from Kiribati as a possibility for taking action, and that's something that the elites that my friend Nick over there referred to take rather seriously and respond to rather quickly, and that's legal action rather than protest action, which they can obviously dismiss as lunatic fringe, whatever. And I suggested that we should think about actually suing through a world court for the loss of their islands and their loss of their income streams. Not necessarily in perpetuity, because the islands might have gone under, but according to the best science, when their island would have gone under naturally, as opposed to due to man-made assisted climate change. So I don't know what they've done with that. Obviously, you said they're moving. So, and it's obviously very difficult in that situation, in the international forum, to know who to sue. You can sue through the court, but then who's liable for damages? Is it on a proportional basis? Do you put a cut-off below that the country's too poor to be considered, etc.? But you can also do it, obviously, locally. For the lady you mentioned about Indigenous people, they could theoretically sue their loss of native title and relocation costs. So that's my first question. Are you aware of any legal actions in this area? I did actually put a question of legal liability to one of the chiefs of one of the major energy suppliers in Australia in regards to the fact that diesel particulates in particular have been classified as a class 1 carcinogen. And you could theoretically sue them because they know that it is and they keep pumping it out. Well, you could argue they're affecting people's health. And he looked very thoughtful. Might go back to his lawyers about that. And so I don't think it's any coincidence that because of these thoughts that the major energy suppliers are going to, they've already announced they're going to shut down their coal-fired power stations starting next decade and finishing the 2040s. They've already announced that. So they can see the writing on the wall. But in terms of enhancing that process, legal actions, well, I'll let you ask that one first, answer that one first if you can, and then I'll give you another one.
I don't know a huge amount about legal action, but I know that one of the ongoing issues has been that there has been for a long time, there was no legal definition of a climate refugee. It wasn't actually covered as part of the UN Convention, and it became very difficult to actually make a legal case based on climate-induced migration. So that's probably it becomes a very difficult argument to make a legal case if there's no legal standing for that type of migration, I suppose. But that's probably only a very partial response to your question. So
I can't add much to that either, but it reminded me about something else which might be relevant, which is the role of collective action from small vulnerable states. So I understand there are various legal actions going on around the world, I just don't have enough detail. But I do want to mention quite a remarkable man from the Marshall Islands, a guy called Tony de Bruyn. He was the foreign minister. He is basically responsible for getting the 1.5 degree target into the Paris Climate Summit. He organised, so the Marshall Islands, there's a whole lot of islands and some of them are going under very, very quickly. I don't know if all of them will go under in the next 100 years, but certainly some more will. Tony de Bruyn organised a group of 40 countries in Manila just a couple of weeks before the Paris Climate Agreement. They were called the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and they made a declaration called the Manila Declaration. They then went all to Paris, and they started a campaign during the Paris climate talks to get 1.5 and not just 2 degrees into the agreement. And then over the course of that 2 weeks, more and more countries every day kept signing on and signing on. So by the end of the meeting, it was something like 112 out of the 195 countries had actually signed on to the 1.5 target. And much to everybody's shock, the 1.5 text remained in the agreement. So it is just an example of really the power of one, I think, who had justice and right on his side, was able to galvanise a collective will of lots of small vulnerable nations that were then joined by larger, less vulnerable nations to make actually a really significant change to that legal agreement.
Well, I was one of the first people in Australia I know to use the term environmental refugees as opposed to climate refugees, because it's whether you can control and sustain your environment, keep it manageable. That is the important thing. Climate is a secondary. See people choking in China. Obviously, it's not just climate that's causing problems with them. But relating back to what I said about speaking to that chief of one of the major energy suppliers, the actual example I used him was what happened with the legal action with cigarette smoking. One proven case of lung cancer and death being caused due to cigarettes caused an immediate change in the industry. So it can be that quick if you can get the right legal avenues. And I can see people maybe in tourist areas and agricultural areas also suing loss of livelihood. We're seeing the problems with the Background Barrier Reef and Courier Mail trying to put a lid on it and not expose all the problems because of the not affecting the tourist industry. But what I wanted to ask was more about the agricultural side. We're seeing at the moment the stories about 330 million Indians having water shortages at the moment. Now there's a major refugee crisis in the making, if ever there was one. I turned to COIN actually, which I don't think has ever been used before, to describe this as geo-agricultural shift, GAS, gas, which I think is appropriate with greenhouse gases, in terms of the fact that we've already seen problems with the so-called marine heat wave that happened in Tasmania that killed off abalone farms and oyster farms down there, 4.5 degrees Celsius above the average of that time of year. Now, that's obviously, we saw the die-off in the reef as well, related to things like that, water warming. But I just wanted to ask you, are you aware of any sort of movements around the world of a major effective scale that are actually being pushed through by farmers and maybe even tourist organisations? We're hearing about the Taj Mahal going green because of the rivers drying up next door and the algae coating the white marble. But I mean, those kind of examples where these things are happening, where there might be immediate cause for legal redress. We're not quite as litigious as they are in America here, but once people's livelihoods are threatened that way, they do look for legal remedies. So I'm just wondering if you have any examples around the world you've heard of.
It is absolutely the case that climate change is an enormous food security issue. Coming back to your water point, about 1/6 of the world's population relies on glacial melt for their water supply, and once the glaciers are gone, that's gone. You know, glaciers are a big frozen reservoir.
Snowcap mountain, yeah.
And snow-capped mountains. So it's an enormous problem. I mean, it's creating security problems by, you know, the energy, water, food nexus is the absolutely critical one. And that's the case in Australia as it is anywhere. And I'll just put in a plug for my next Climate Council report, which is on rural communities. And we've called it On the Front Line because it's the great paradox in Australian politics, I think, that, coming back to being political, is that farmers and rural communities are absolutely most at the front line of climate change in Australia and elsewhere in the world. Yet, for some paradoxical reason, the conservative elements of our political spectrum representing their rural constituents are the most resistant to climate change action. And if anybody can solve that problem, I'd like to hear them. I was amused, as I'm sure many of you were on the weekend, the Good Weekend with Barnaby Joyce's quote that, well, maybe there is something going on. I haven't seen it this dry before. But I think, however, painting all farmers like that is absolutely misleading. There are an enormous proportion of Australian farmers who are deeply, deeply worried about climate change because they are living it every day. Whether they will find a way to take legal action, well, I think that's down the track.
So please join me in thanking the two speakers once again.